My name is Jennifer and I am a 31-year-old captain in the United States Army Special Operations, a career defined by calculated risks and the kind of high-stakes pressure that makes civilian life seem like a slow-motion film, but nothing in my 10 years of service, not even the grueling nights in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia or the dust-choked compounds in the Middle East, prepared me for the moment my own sister looked at me with the cold, predatory detachment of an enemy. Insurgent. Standing on the manicured lawn of our family's colonial-style estate in Alexandria, Virginia, a property valued at a staggering $2.4 million according to the latest Zillow assessment, I felt the weight of a decade of resentment boiling over as Lydia adjusted the sharp lapels of her $1,200 Max Mara blazer in a shade of sand beige that perfectly matched her calculated, bloodless expression. The air was thick with the suffocating humidity of a Virginia July, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin like a wet wool blanket, and I could hear the rhythmic, expensive hum of the dual-zone HVAC system struggling to keep the main house at a crisp 68 degrees while we stood outside in the glare of the afternoon sun. "You are just a blunt instrument, Jen," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a condescending edge that sliced through the heavy air more effectively than a combat knife, her eyes scanning my tactical posture with genuine disgust as she reminded me that I was a soldier trained to follow orders and not a sophisticated strategist capable of managing the complex financial web of a multi-million-dollar family legacy. She told me to step aside before I got hurt, a threat so absurdly misplaced considering I had spent my adult life surviving environments she couldn't even fathom while she spent hers navigating the treacherous social waters of DC fundraising galas and boutique real estate firms. But I am getting ahead of myself, and to truly understand how the bond of sisterhood dissolved into a legal and emotional war zone, I have to take you back to the day the foundations of my world actually cracked. It started with a phone call that reached me while I was finishing a grueling training rotation at Fort Liberty, the vibration of my ruggedized smartphone buzzing against a metal laminate table in a mess hall that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and overstewed coffee. My father, a man who had built a construction empire from the red clay of Virginia and who always wore a $20,000 Patek Philippe Nautilus even when he was inspecting a muddy job site, had been rushed to a Nova Alexandria hospital after a massive coronary event. By the time I secured emergency leave and drove my matte gray 2024 Toyota Tacoma TRD Pro up I-95, the man who had been my North Star was gone, leaving behind a vacuum of power that Lydia was all too eager to fill with her own ambitions. While I was mourning the loss of the man who taught me how to strip a rifle and how to stand tall, Lydia was already in the study, her fingers tracing the mahogany grain of his desk as she looked at the portfolio of properties and investment accounts like a wolf surveying a defenseless flock. She had always been the favorite, the golden child who stayed close to home, the one who attended every charity brunch while I was overseas, and she used that proximity to whisper poison into the ears of our family's legal counsel, claiming my frequent deployments made me mentally unstable and legally unfit to serve as a co-executor of the estate. The betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion but a slow, methodical siege, a series of locked doors and misplaced documents that culminated in this confrontation on the lawn where the scent of freshly cut Kentucky bluegrass mixed with the metallic tang of my own adrenaline. Standing there, I realized that family isn't defined by the blood running through your veins or the name etched on a birth certificate. Family is the person who stands beside you when the vultures start circling, and in that moment, looking at my sister's expensive heels sinking into the expensive dirt, I knew I wasn't facing a sibling, but a target that needed to be neutralized. The disparity between our lives wasn't just a gap in income. It was a fundamental difference in the weight of our souls, a contrast that felt as sharp as a bayonet whenever I pulled my 2014 sterling gray Ford F-150 into the pristine circular driveway of the family estate. My truck, with 165,000 miles on the odometer and a persistent rattle in the suspension that echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, was a rolling testament to the grit of my daily existence. I lived in a 900-square-foot fixer-upper on the outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina, a place where the drywall was perpetually dusty and the air smelled of sawdust and the cheap industrial grease I used to maintain my own gear. Every single month, I sat at my scarred kitchen table with a calculator and a physical ledger, meticulously tracking every cent of my $4,500 base salary, minus the federal taxes and the SGLI premiums, just to ensure I could cover the mounting medical debts my mother had accrued during her struggle with chronic kidney disease. While I spent my precious leave time on my hands and knees under her kitchen sink, replacing corroded copper piping and fixing leaky faucets with a set of craftsman tools I'd owned since I was 20. Lydia was busy constructing a facade of success built on the crumbling remains of our mother's financial security. My sister claimed to be a high-level strategic consultant, a vague title that served as a smokescreen for the fact that she hadn't held a steady paycheck in over 3 years, yet she moved through the world with the unearned confidence of a billionaire. I watched her climb out of her leased 2024 Alpine white BMW 5 Series, a vehicle that drained $850 a month from a bank account she didn't even fund herself, and saw the way she swung her $3,500 Celine Triomphe handbag over her shoulder as if it were a shield against the reality of her own parasitic nature. It was a sickening realization to discover that the money for those designer Italian leather bags and the premium synthetic oil changes for her German sedan wasn't coming from consulting fees, but was being systematically siphoned from our mother's dwindling Vanguard retirement fund, a nest egg that was supposed to provide dignity in her final years. Lydia viewed that money as her birthright, a stipend for the exhausting work of being the visible daughter, while I was the one working double shifts and skipping meals to pay for the $600 a month co-pays on our mother's dialysis treatments. The injustice of it burned in my chest like a flare in the night, a searing heat that made my hands clench into fists as I looked at her perfectly manicured nails, which had never known the rough texture of a wrench or the biting cold of a weapons slide in February. She was living a life of luxury financed by the slow-motion theft of our mother's future, spending hundreds on artisanal lattes and Equinox gym memberships while I was calculating the price per gallon of diesel to make sure I could afford the drive back to base. This wasn't just a sibling rivalry. It was a collision between a woman who sacrificed everything for the people she loved and a woman who sacrificed the people she loved for everything she wanted. Every time she spoke about managing the estate, I could see the mental tally she was making of the mahogany furniture and the silver sets, her eyes darting toward the antique cabinets like a looter waiting for the lights to go out. I stood there in my faded cargo pants and a 5-year-old cotton t-shirt, feeling the grit of real work under my fingernails, and realized that while I was building a life out of discipline and duty, Lydia was merely decorating a hollow shell with stolen gold. The betrayal hit with the precision of a sniper's bullet at exactly 11:42 a.m. inside the cramped, dimly lit interior of Torres Tech Repair, a shop tucked away in a weathered brick storefront where the air hung heavy with the sharp metallic scent of ozone and the acrid tang of melting solder. Marco, a former Marine sergeant who had lost part of his left ear to an IED in Fallujah and who now spent his days coaxing life back into shattered electronics, didn't say a word as he slid a rugged Panasonic Toughbook across the scarred laminate counter toward me. My hands, which had remained steady during high-altitude jumps and midnight extraction missions, felt a sudden icy tremor as I looked at the mirrored data harvested from the midnight blue iPhone 13 that Lydia had accidentally dropped into a puddle 3 days prior, claiming it was a total loss and begging me to take it to a specialist for data recovery. The glowing screen displayed a sequence of encrypted iMessages sent to a contact labeled simply as R, and as I scrolled through the digital trail of her malice, I felt the oxygen physically leave the room, leaving my lungs burning in the stagnant air of the shop. The words were clinical, devoid of any sisterly affection, and laid out a roadmap for my own demise with the cold efficiency of a logistics officer planning a supply run. One message sent at 3 a.m. particularly stood out. The service members' group life insurance forms are forged, it read, followed by a chilling confirmation that once I was confirmed incapacitated or missing during my next high-risk rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center, the $400,000 death benefit payout would be routed directly to an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. Step 5 is complete, the final text concluded, and I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that my own flesh and blood had placed a literal countdown on my life for the price of a mid-sized suburban house. The 48-inch LED monitor on Marco's workbench flickered, casting a ghoulish blue light over my face as I processed the depth of the conspiracy Lydia had woven while I was busy worrying about our mother's dialysis bills. She hadn't just been stealing from the retirement fund. She had been actively weaponizing my service to the country, turning my upcoming deployment into a financial exit strategy that required me to never come home. Marco leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the spring groaning under his weight, and his eyes met mine with a look of grim, soldierly understanding that required no explanation. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my military training began to override the shock, cooling my blood and sharpening my focus until the betrayal became just another tactical problem to be solved. I thought about the $400,000 payout, a sum I had intended to provide for our mother's long-term care, and realized Lydia had already spent it in her mind, probably eyeing a bigger BMW or a summer home in the Hamptons while I was preparing to put my life on the line in the dirt. The hum of a nearby cooling fan seemed to grow deafening as I stared at the digital evidence of my sister's treachery, knowing that the woman I grew up with was gone, replaced by a predator who viewed my heartbeat as nothing more than a barrier to her next wire transfer. Standing in that small shop surrounded by the skeletons of broken laptops and tangled charging cables, I felt the last shred of my family loyalty disintegrate into ash. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was a target in a war I hadn't known was being fought, and as I reached for my encrypted thumb drive to save the logs, I knew that Lydia's Step 5 was the last one she would ever complete. The clock on my dashboard read 2:15 a.m. as I sat in the driver's seat of my Ford F-150 in the deserted parking lot of a 24-hour Home Depot, the orange glow of the high-pressure sodium lights casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt while the engine ticked as it cooled down in the stillness of the night. I didn't cry because tears are a luxury of the safe, and in the military, you learn quickly that emotion without action is just wasted energy, so instead of breaking down I reached into the center console and pulled out my olive-drab tactical write-in-the-rain notebook, the waterproof pages crinkling under my touch. Using a black space pen I drew a cold, analytical grid that divided my world into two distinct operational theaters. Column A was labeled Assets, encompassing my mother's 3-bedroom colonial house, her dwindling pension from the school district, and the life insurance policy I had bled for. Column B was labeled Threats, a list that began with Lydia's name in sharp, aggressive lettering, followed by her legal shark Sloan Mercer and the growing pile of forged signatures they had used to strip our family bare. It was in that moment, with the hum of a distant refrigerator truck as my only soundtrack, that I realized love was a liability I could no longer afford to carry in my pack if I wanted to survive this domestic insurgency. I walked into the cavernous, brightly lit store and moved with purpose through the aisles, my boots echoing on the concrete floors as I selected $142 worth of high-security Schlage deadbolts with reinforced strike plates and a set of Ring stick-up cameras capable of infrared night vision. The cashier, a tired teenager with a faded name tag, didn't even look up as I paid with my military star card, the transaction feeling like the purchase of ammunition before a final stand. By 3:45 a.m. I was back at my mother's house, the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke as I began the systematic process of fortifying the perimeter against the sister who shared my DNA but none of my honor. I replaced the flimsy builder-grade locks with the new hardware, the rhythmic rasp of my screwdriver and the metallic snap of the tumblers falling into place serving as a countdown to Lydia's total exclusion from this sanctuary. I positioned the smart cameras to cover every point of entry, ensuring that any attempt she made to cross the threshold would be recorded in high definition and uploaded to a cloud server she could never touch. As I tightened the final screw on the back door, I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me, a realization that I was effectively excommunicating my own sister from our family home before the sun had even begun to graze the Virginia skyline. I wasn't just changing locks, I was amputating a gangrenous limb to save the rest of the body. And as the status lights on the cameras blinked from red to a steady, watchful blue, I knew that the version of me who tolerated betrayal was dead. This house was no longer a target of opportunity for a predator in a Max Mara blazer. It was a hardened position, and I was the commander standing guard over the only person left who mattered. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the oak trees, the physical transformation was complete, leaving Lydia with nothing but a useless key and a digital footprint of her own greed. I sat on the porch steps, the cold metal of my Kershaw folding knife resting in my pocket, and watched the neighborhood wake up, knowing that when the world finally realized what she had done, I would be the one holding the line. Family is built on trust, but when that trust is forged into a weapon and pointed at your chest, the only rational response is to build a wall so high that no amount of manipulation can ever scale it again. The air inside the mahogany-lined office of Jared Wolf on K Street in Washington, D.C., was a pressurized mixture of expensive roasted espresso beans and the dry, vanilla-scented dust of vintage legal volumes that lined the floor-to-ceiling shelves like a fortress of forgotten justice. Jared, a former judge advocate general officer who had traded his dress blues for bespoke charcoal pinstripe suits and a reputation as a white-collar shark, sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark walnut that probably cost more than my first 3 years of military housing allowance. I placed the heavy manila folder on the polished surface with a deliberate metallic thud, feeling the phantom weight of the betrayal finally shifting from my shoulders onto the legal machinery I was about to ignite. Inside that folder were 42 pages of meticulously indexed destruction, a digital and physical paper trail that Marco and I had spent the last 72 hours scrubbing for every microscopic inconsistency Lydia thought she had hidden. I pointed to the first tab, showing the metadata logs that proved with surgical precision that the forged signatures on the estate amendments had been uploaded from an IP address registered to Harborline Financial, the very firm where Lydia's lover worked as a senior VP. Beside those logs lay a sworn, notarized affidavit from Dr. Bennett Shaw, the family's longtime physician, whose signature had been clumsily replicated on the medical power of attorney documents. His statement was a stinging rebuke of Lydia's claim that our mother was mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs. Then there were the 15 high-resolution screenshots of the Step 5 plan from the encrypted messaging app, a digital confession that laid out her intent to capitalize on my potential death in the line of duty with the coldness of a corporate merger. Jared leaned forward, the light from a green-shaded banker's lamp reflecting off his designer glasses as he flipped through the pages with a slow, predatory rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't look like a lawyer in that moment. He looked like a commander reviewing an intelligence brief before a scorched-earth offensive. He finally closed the folder and looked up at me, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that vibrated through the quiet room as he told me that we weren't just going to sue her for breach of fiduciary duty or fraud. "We are going to dismantle her," he said, his fingers tracing the edge of the forged life insurance form as if he were feeling the pulse of an enemy. He began outlining a strategy that involved notifying the state bar, filing for an immediate freezing of all siphoned assets, and coordinating with the military's Criminal Investigation Division to escalate the forgery of SGLI documents to a federal level. I sat there in the leather armchair, my spine straight and my gaze fixed on the Washington Monument visible through the window, realizing that the sister I once protected was about to experience the full, unmitigated force of the tactical discipline she had mocked. Every designer bag she bought with stolen money, every payment on that leased BMW, and every lie she told to the estate executors was now a nail in the coffin of her social and professional life. I felt no pity as Jared began typing the first of several cease and desist orders and emergency injunctions on his mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking sounding like a distant machine gun nest. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a counterinsurgency operation conducted in the courtrooms of the Capitol, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I felt the cold, hard certainty of impending victory. Lydia had spent years playing a game of shadows and manipulation, but she had forgotten one crucial rule of engagement. Never target a soldier who has nothing left to lose and an arsenal of truth at her disposal. As I walked out of that office into the crisp DC air, I knew the countdown wasn't on my life anymore, but on the lifestyle she had built from the wreckage of our family's trust. The trap was set for Saturday at precisely 6 o'clock in the evening, a time when the golden hour light usually bathed the Potomac River in a deceptive, peaceful glow, but inside the rented glass-walled waterfront gallery in Alexandria, the air was vibrating with the hollow prestige of a high society ambush. Lydia had spared no expense for this family and investors mixer, burning through $4,200 of our mother's remaining liquidity to lease the space, hire a catering crew in white silk vests, and decorate the room with centerpieces of white orchids that smelled like a funeral parlor. There were 55 guests in attendance, a calculated collection of local board members, old money neighbors from the historic district, and a handful of wealthy marks she was grooming to invest in a real estate venture that existed only in her imagination and on a series of forged spreadsheets. I watched through the panoramic windows for a moment, standing in the shadows of the parking lot next to my F-150, seeing Lydia mid-toast as she stood on a raised dais with the river behind her, looking every bit the successful heiress in a floor-length navy gown that probably cost as much as a used sedan. She was holding a crystal flute filled with $95 Veuve Clicquot, her voice amplified by a discreet Bose sound system as she smugly celebrated her new appointment as the sole conservator of the Coleman estate, a title she had stolen with a pen and a lie. The outdoor thermometer read a perfect 72 degrees. But the moment I gripped the heavy brass handles of the gallery doors and stepped inside, The atmosphere in the room turned sub-zero as if a polar front had been sucked through the ventilation. I wasn't wearing the casual civilian clothes she expected me to be hiding in. I was in my full dress blues, the high collar stiff against my jaw and my chest heavy with the silver and bronze of my jump wings, my ranger tab, and the ribbons of 3 combat tours, symbols of the very oath of service she had mocked and attempted to monetize. The rhythmic click of my polished black low quarters on the polished concrete floor was the only sound in the room as the 55 guests turned, their hushed conversations dying mid-sentence like a failing engine. Lydia's hand froze, the champagne trembling in the glass as her practiced, porcelain smile shattered into a jagged mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at me and saw not just her sister, but a captain of the United States Army who had come to collect a debt of honor that no amount of stolen inheritance could ever repay. I didn't stop until I was 5 feet from her, the light from the gallery's industrial chandeliers glinting off my brass buttons and the cold, hard reality of my presence stripping away the layers of her carefully constructed fantasy. She had told these people I was unstable, that I was a broken tool relegated to the scrap heap of a distant war. But as I stood there with my spine as straight as a steel girder, the contrast between her borrowed luxury and my earned authority was undeniable. The silence stretched until it was physically painful, a vacuum of sound where the only thing that mattered was the folder I carried tucked under my left arm, the 42 pages of evidence that were about to turn her victory gala into a crime scene. I watched the realization wash over her face like a physical blow. She had thought I was the blunt instrument, but she had forgotten that a soldier's greatest weapon isn't a rifle, it's the truth delivered with the force of a landslide. Family is the foundation you build your life on, but when that foundation is made of sand and deceit, it only takes one person standing in the light to watch it all wash away into the dark waters of the Potomac. The execution was surgical, a tactical maneuver carried out with the cold, rhythmic precision of a pre-dawn raid where the target has no idea the perimeter has already been breached. I did not scream, I did not lunge at her, and I did not let the blistering rage behind my ribs dictate the tempo of the engagement because in my world, the loudest person in the room is usually the one losing the fight. Instead, I stepped onto the small mahogany riser, my polished low quarters sounding like a gavel against the wood, and I reached out to tap the slender neck of the Shure microphone which sent a sharp, crystalline pop echoing through the high-end Bose surround sound system. I looked directly at the 55 guests, seeing the confusion in the eyes of the city council members and the sudden, sharp interest from the local developers, and I spoke with the calm, flat inflection of a briefing officer delivering a casualty report. I told them that I had a few critical updates to the transition plan my sister had been so eloquently describing, a statement that caused the glass of $95 champagne in Lydia's hand to tilt precariously as the blood began to drain from her face. With a nod to a fellow veteran I'd positioned at the back of the room, we began the systematic distribution of 50 professionally bound color-coded packets, each one containing high-resolution copies of the forged SLI life insurance forms and the decrypted Step 5 text messages that outlined her plan for my professional and physical liquidation. The room went silent, a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound that was suddenly broken when a prominent donor in the front row dropped his sterling silver appetizer fork, the metal clattering against the polished concrete floor with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot. I watched as the guests flipped through the pages, their eyes widening as they reached the metadata proofs that traced the origin of the forged documents back to a laptop registered in Lydia's name and an IP address she used every day. My sister's face turned the color of cold wood ash, a grayish, sickly hue that made her expensive makeup look like a crumbling mask, especially as the crowd began to whisper the words incapacitation and disappearance under their breath. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out against the overwhelming weight of the evidence I had just placed in the hands of every influential person she had ever tried to impress. This wasn't just a social faux pas, it was the public dismantling of a predator, a total exposure of the fact that she had been measuring me for a coffin while I was overseas serving the very country that gave her the freedom to be this greedy. The orchids on the table seemed to wilt under the sudden shift in pressure, and the humid Virginia air outside felt miles away from the sub-zero reality of the gallery interior where Lydia's social capital was evaporating in real time. I stood there in my dress blues, my ribbons reflecting the harsh gallery lights, and I felt the profound clarity of a mission accomplished, knowing that while she had spent months weaving a web of lies, it only took 5 minutes of documented truth to tear it all down. Family is a bond of blood, but justice is a bond of action. And as I watched the first guest stand up and walk toward the exit without a word to my sister, I knew the insurgency was over and the occupation of the truth had begun. The high-pitched, desperate shriek that erupted from Lydia's throat shattered the remaining veneer of her carefully curated social standing, a raw and ugly sound that bounced off the industrial glass walls of the gallery like a trapped bird hitting a window pane. "This is a private matter," she screamed, her voice cracking as she clutched the edge of the mahogany riser, her knuckles turning a ghostly white and her expensive Max Mara blazer bunching at the shoulders as she looked around at the 55 guests who were now staring at her with a mixture of clinical disgust and profound horror. I stood my ground, my posture as unyielding as the granite of the mountains I had trained on, and I looked her dead in the eye with a gaze that had seen far worse things than a socialite's tantrum, feeling a cold, hollow satisfaction as I told her that it had indeed been a private matter until the moment she decided to forge a federal document and weaponize a soldier's life insurance for her own gain. The words hung in the humid Virginia air like a heavy curtain, and I leaned in just enough for her to smell the faint scent of gun oil and starch on my uniform as I informed her that the Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI were not just aware of her schemes, but were currently waiting in the sterile, marble-floored lobby of the building. I didn't wait for her to craft another lie or to witness the inevitable collapse of her knees. I simply turned on my heel, the rhythmic click of my low quarters marking my departure from the life of a victim and my return to the role of a commander. As I walked toward the heavy brass exit doors, I passed 4 plainclothes agents moving in the opposite direction with the quiet, purposeful stride of men who had already secured their perimeter, their badges glinting under the gallery's halogen track lighting. Behind me, the sound of silver handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silence of the room, a metallic finality that stripped Lydia of her name, her leased luxury, and her stolen status in a single, sharp motion. I pushed through the doors into the 72-degree night, the fresh air off the Potomac filling my lungs and washing away the stagnant scent of orchids and expensive champagne that had felt like a shroud. 2 hours later, while I was sitting in my mother's kitchen with a cup of black coffee and the silent hum of the new high-security cameras monitoring the yard, I received a text from Jared Wolfe confirming that Sloan Mercer had been taken into custody at his $5 million estate in Great Falls, arrested in front of his neighbors while still wearing his silk smoking jacket. The legal machinery was now grinding forward with a relentless mechanical force that no amount of charm or consulting could ever hope to stall. And as I watched the moonlight reflect off the hood of my weathered Ford F-150, I realized that the war for our family's dignity had finally reached its conclusion. Lydia had tried to turn my death into a transaction, but she had only succeeded in ensuring that her own life as she knew it was effectively over. I had spent a decade protecting people who would never know my name, and in the end protecting my mother from the monster we had raised under our own roof was the most difficult mission I had ever completed. Family isn't just about sharing a last name or a set of chromosomes. It is a sacred trust that, once broken by the poison of greed, can never truly be mended, only survived. As the sun began to hint at another dawn over Alexandria, I finally felt the weight of the last few months lift, replaced by the quiet, heavy peace of a soldier who had successfully defended the home front. The cleanup was as thorough and merciless as a post-mission site exploitation, leaving no stone unturned and no shadow for Lydia to crawl back into once the legal machinery of Jared Wolfe began its relentless grind. Within 48 hours of the gallery confrontation, Jared had successfully filed an emergency injunction in the Fairfax County Circuit Court, a decisive strike that stripped my sister of every remaining legal tie to the Coleman family name and our mother's healthcare decisions. Every single financial account Lydia had touched, from the primary Vanguard retirement fund to the secondary savings accounts at Navy Federal, was frozen solid by federal order, leaving her with nothing but the rapidly diminishing cash in her Celine handbag and the mounting dread of a looming indictment. The transition from her curated life of luxury to the stark reality of her crimes was swift and brutal, beginning with the repossession of her Alpine white BMW 5 Series after the lease payments, which she had been siphoning from Mom's pension, finally bounced like a rubber ball. Watching the tow truck haul that German-engineered status symbol out of her driveway felt like watching the final mast of a sinking ship disappear beneath the waves, a physical manifestation of her plummeting social and financial standing. With her credit score shattered and her reputation in the DC consulting world reduced to radioactive ash, Lydia was forced to retreat into a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated section of Anacostia, A place where the air smelled of stale grease and the sound of distant sirens was the only nocturnal soundtrack. Her new reality was a cramped room with peeling linoleum floors and a single window that looked out onto a rusted fire escape, a far cry from the $1,200 night hotel suites she used to frequent on someone else's dime. She now spends her days meeting with a public defender who looks half as sharp as Jared Wolf, facing 3 heavy felony counts of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft that carry a combined maximum sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Every time I sit in my mother's quiet living room, listening to the steady, healthy hum of her new medical equipment which is now fully funded and secure, I think about the cost of greed and the absolute weight of a broken oath. I spent my life defending the borders of this country, never realizing the most dangerous insurgent was the one sitting across from me at Thanksgiving dinner, but the perimeter is finally secure and the threat has been neutralized with the kind of tactical permanence only the truth can provide. My mother doesn't ask about her anymore, perhaps because the betrayal was too deep to even give voice to, or perhaps because she finally feels the peace of being protected by the daughter who actually showed up when the faucets leaked and the world got dark. Family isn't a birthright or a blood type. It is a series of choices made in the trenches of everyday life, and as I look at my 2014 Ford F-150 parked in the driveway, its high-mileage engine ready for the next mission, I know that I made the right ones. The $3,500 handbags and the Max Mara blazers are gone, replaced by the orange jumpsuits of a looming trial, and for the first time in 31 years, the air in this house finally feels clean. I am Captain Jennifer Coleman, and while I may have lost a sister, I saved my mother, my honor, and the legacy my father spent a lifetime building from the red Virginia clay. The mission is complete, the assets are recovered, and the only thing left to do is live a life that Lydia could never understand. A life built on the quiet, unshakable foundation of integrity. The transition was finally complete when I moved my mother into her new suite at the Wellington, a high-end assisted living facility in McLean that was a world away from the sterile, underfunded shadow operations Lydia had scouted as potential fronts for her shell companies. This was a place of genuine substance, featuring solid oak crown molding and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a private 4-acre botanical garden, a sanctuary where the staff-to-resident ratio was a comforting 1:3 and the medical director was a board-certified geriatrician with 30 years of clinical experience. Every month, I sit at the antique secretary desk in her sunlit living room and authorize the $6,200 wire transfer for her all-inclusive care, a sum that used to feel like an impossible mountain but is now easily covered by the recovered assets that Jared Wolf clawed back from the offshore accounts Sloan Mercer had tried to launder. It is a profound, poetic sort of justice to see the very funds intended for Lydia's designer splurges and Mercer's high-stakes gambling now being transformed into 24-hour nursing care, physical therapy sessions in a heated saltwater pool, and gourmet meals prepared by a dedicated culinary team. For the first time in nearly a decade as I walk through the threshold of her new home, the air is thick with the scent of her favorite Jo Malone lavender and lovage candles, a fragrance that finally smells like genuine peace instead of the desperate, cloying manipulation Lydia used to mask the rot of her schemes. I watched my mother sit in her new velvet armchair, her hands no longer trembling as she turned the pages of a hardback book, the light of the Virginia afternoon catching the silver in her hair and reflecting off the framed photos of our family that I had carefully arranged on the mantel. The constant gnawing anxiety that had defined my life since my father's passing has been replaced by the quiet, steady hum of a secure perimeter, a feeling of mission success that is more rewarding than any commendation or medal I've ever pinned to my uniform. I still drive my high-mileage 2014 Ford F-150, its engine roaring with a familiar, honest grit as I navigate the tree-lined streets of McLean, and I still check the high-definition feeds of my encrypted security system every night at 2200 hours, but the nature of my vigilance has shifted from defense to preservation. Lydia is a fading echo in a 400-square-foot cell, her world reduced to the dimensions of her own greed, while our mother is finally thriving in a reality built on the bedrock of the truth I fought to uncover. I realized then that while you cannot choose the people you are related to by blood, you can absolutely choose the life you lead and the people you protect with your last breath. As I left the facility that evening, the lavender scent lingering on my tactical jacket, I looked up at the stars and felt the immense, silent gratitude of a daughter who had finally brought her mother home to a place where the locks were strong and the love was real. Family is not defined by the betrayal of one, but by the loyalty of the one who stays, and as I shifted my truck into gear, I knew that the Coleman legacy was no longer a target of opportunity, but a fortress of integrity that would stand long after the court cases were closed and the headlines had faded into history. Money can buy a Max Mara Blazer or a leased BMW, but it can never purchase the quiet conscience of a soldier who did her duty when the world was watching and, more importantly, when it wasn't. The smell of lavender in the air was the final after-action report I needed to know that the objective had been seized. The high ground was ours, and for the first time in my 31 years, the war was truly over. The clock on my ruggedized Garmin smartwatch vibrated with a silent notification at exactly 8:14 p.m. as I sat on the weathered wooden steps of my porch, the humid Virginia evening finally yielding to a cool breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle from the edge of the woods. Bailey, my 7-year-old Belgian Malinois who had seen as many dusty airfields as I had, rested his heavy, scarred chin on my thigh, his tail thumping a steady, rhythmic beat against the porch floorboards that mirrored the calm pace of my own heart. In the fading amber glow of a sunset that streaked the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange, the screen of my phone illuminated with a high-priority email notification from an address I recognized as belonging to Lydia's lead public defender, a man who was now tasked with the impossible job of humanizing a woman who had spent years treating her family like a series of liquid assets. I didn't need to read the subject line to know what it contained, but the preview text confirmed the desperation of her legal team as they begged for a formal character reference, a plea for leniency to help her avoid the mandatory minimum of a 10-year federal sentence for the aggravated identity theft and wire fraud charges that were now a matter of public record. They wanted me to speak of the sister she used to be, to provide a narrative of sibling bonds that she herself had severed with the cold precision of a forged signature. But as I looked at the digital request, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, crystalline sense of detachment. I didn't even grant the message the dignity of being opened, let alone read, because there was no testimony left in my soul that could possibly outweigh the 42 pages of evidence currently sitting in a federal prosecutor's file. With a single deliberate motion of my thumb, I swiped left and hit the delete button, watching the digital ghost of her plea vanish into a black hole of discarded data before I took the additional step of blocking the entire law firm's domain to ensure that the silence remained absolute. Lydia had spent our entire lives mocking the soldier mode I retreated into, calling it a lack of personality and a rigid refusal to enjoy the finer things in life, never realizing that it was precisely that discipline, that unwavering adherence to a code of conduct, and that tactical foresight which had ultimately saved the family she had tried so systematically to destroy. The very traits she despised, the meticulous record-keeping, the skepticism of unearned luxury, and the readiness to identify a threat, were the weapons I used to dismantle her insurgency and secure my mother's future in a world that no longer had room for her brand of parasitic ambition. I leaned back against the porch railing, feeling the solid, honest weight of the house behind me and the warmth of the dog at my side, realizing that my father's legacy was finally safe because I had been willing to be the blunt instrument she so feared. The orange light of the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the yard into a peaceful twilight where the only sounds were the crickets in the grass and the distant fading hum of the interstate, a stark contrast to the chaotic hollow noise Lydia had tried to build her life upon. I took a slow breath of the cooling air, feeling the tension that had occupied my shoulders for months finally dissipate like smoke in a gale, knowing that the perimeter was not just held but permanently fortified against any future betrayal. Family isn't a word you use to get out of trouble or a shield you hide behind when your greed is exposed. It is a sacred duty that requires the kind of sacrifice Lydia was never capable of understanding. As I stood up to lead Bailey inside, the soft glow of the kitchen light through the window promised a quiet night of safety and truth, a simple luxury that no $1,200 blazer or $3,500 handbag could ever possibly buy. My name is Captain Jennifer Coleman, and while the world outside might see a soldier who fought a war of documents and data, I know that I am simply a daughter who held the line when it mattered most. The mission is closed, the target is neutralized, and for the first time in my life, the silence of the evening doesn't feel like a ceasefire, but like a hard-won and permanent peace. The aftermath of the legal and emotional storm was not marked by a grand celebration or a public display of triumph, but by a quiet, heavy victory that settled over my life like the calm after a frantic extraction mission. My 900-square-foot fixer-upper, once a source of stress and a symbol of my financial struggle, had been transformed into a literal and figurative fortress of truth, fortified by the high-security Schlag deadbolts and the silent, unblinking eyes of the Ring cameras that monitored every inch of the perimeter. I sat at my scarred kitchen table, the same place where I had once meticulously tracked every cent of my $4,500 salary, and felt the incredible lightness of a life finally purged of the parasite that had been draining our family's lifeblood for years. I had lost a sister, a woman who shared my father's eyes but none of his character, yet in that loss, I had gained a future defined by a profound and unshakable freedom from the manipulation and the constant, low-grade fever of Lydia's greed. The $24 million estate was no longer a weapon she could use against me, and the $400,000 SLI policy remained exactly what it was meant to be: a safeguard for my mother's dignity, not a payday for a predator in a Max Mara blazer. Every time I drove my 2014 Ford F-150 past the gated communities where Lydia used to pretend she belonged, I felt a surge of pride in the grit and the discipline that she had so frequently mocked, realizing that the very soldier mode she despised was the shield that kept our mother safe and our father's legacy intact. The silence in my home was no longer lonely. It was the peaceful sound of a mission successfully concluded, a tactical environment where every asset was accounted for and every threat had been neutralized with the finality of a federal indictment. I think about the contrast between the $6,200 monthly care at the Wellington, where my mother now spends her days surrounded by the scent of real lavender and the care of professionals, and the 400-square-foot studio apartment where Lydia is currently awaiting her trial, and I feel no remorse, only the cold clarity of a debt paid in full. Choosing between blood family and my own survival was the most difficult engagement of my career, but as I watch the sun rise over the Virginia skyline, I know that loyalty is earned through action, not granted by birthright. My life is now my own, unburdened by the forged signatures and the secret offshore trusts that once threatened to bury me, and I stand as the sole commander of a life built on the rugged, honest foundation of the truth. Family is the person who stands in the gap when the world tries to break you, and in the end I was the only one left standing in that gap. A soldier who did her duty and a daughter who finally found the courage to cut ties with a ghost. The struggle is over, the perimeter is secure, and for the first time in 31 years I am not just surviving, I am finally free to live.